Hello, my name's Audrey Collins and I'm the National Archives Family History Specialist. I've been tracing family histories for more than 30 years and I want to use some of what I've learned to help you as you work on your own research. If you've already watched our webinars on researching in later periods, or if you've already researched back to the mid-19th century, you'll be quite familiar with the main sources. From the present day back to around 1840, your research will be based around civil registers of birth, marriage and death, and census records back from 1921. Depending on the kind of family you're tracing, you may have used many other kinds of records, but birth, marriage, death and census records are the core sources for every family in England and Wales. And most of what I'm going to be saying here applies to the kind of records that you will find for England and Wales. But some of the principles will apply to Scotland or Ireland and other places as well. This is aimed at guiding you through researching in the early decades of the 19th century and the later ones of the 18th. You will have been using birth, marriage and death records for information about individuals and their immediate families. And of course the census is invaluable for connecting them with their wider families and seeing them in the context of the communities where they lived. You might also have used wills and other probate records, another good source for finding out about family relationships. But when you reach the 1830s, you'll find yourself in unfamiliar research territory. There are no civil birth, marriage and death certificates and no census records. For details of births, marriages and deaths, you'll have to rely on church records of baptisms, marriages and burials, mostly those from the Church of England. And the first thing you'll notice about them is that they contain less information than the civil registers. You'll get a date of baptism, which is usually soon after a date of birth, but can be much later, and most entries don't include the date of birth. Even worse, the names of the parents don't include the mother's maiden name, which makes it much harder to look for a marriage. And if you're looking at marriage register entries, you'll see that they contain much less detail than the ones you're used to. There's no information about the occupations or the parents of the couple. The residence information is just the parish, not a full address, and ages are generally just full age or minor. As if this weren't bad enough, before 1841 there's no real equivalent of the census records that have been so helpful to this point. Although censuses have been taken every 10 years since 1801, very few of those early records have survived, and those that have survived are much less detailed than even the 1841 census. So at this point, you might be wondering if you should just give up, but of course the answer is no. There is still plenty that you can do, but you will need to learn some new research skills and start to use records that may be unfamiliar to you. The first thing to do is to go back to the basic questions. What are you trying to find out, and what records are likely to contain the information that you will need to extend your family tree? You'll continue doing some of the things that you should have already been doing, in that you should always use more than one source rather than relying on a single one. And now, because the sources are likely to be less detailed, you may need to use even more of them to be sure you found the right person and to progress your research. And there are plenty of records to be found if you know where to look and how to use them. Another feature of these early records is that very few of them are held in one central location, unlike birth, marriage and death records from 1837, census records from 1841, and wills and probate records from 1858. So while some records are held here at the National Archives, most of the records you need to use will be from county record offices or other local archives. But a good place to start is the research guides in our family history category. They'll tell you about records that aren't held at the National Archives as well as those that are, often with links to where you can find them. The 1851 census is a good jumping off point for earlier research because it gives ages and birthplaces. And if you know the area that someone came from, you can look for records there for the next stages of your research. This is a page from the 1851 census showing the Scott family. You can tell that this family had moved around a lot from the birthplaces of the children. Only the youngest of them, Charles, was born in Bath, where they were at the time of the census. His full name was actually Charles Prestwich Scott, who became famous in later life as C.P. Scott, the editor of the Manchester Guardian. We can see that his father, Russell Scott, was born in Portsmouth, and his mother, Isabella, was born in Wandsworth. So this tells you where you'd expect to find records of their births, or more likely baptisms. You can also work out from the ages and birthplaces of the older children that Russell and Isabella probably married in the London area in the early 1830s. Now, the older children were born before civil registration, so they won't have birth certificates to tell you their mother's maiden name. And if you have an ancestor who was born around this time, it's worth looking to see if they had any younger siblings, like Charles, born after 1837, and get their birth certificate to find the mother's maiden name. So in this case, I already knew that Isabella's maiden surname was Prestwich, which is no great surprise, since this was also Charles's middle name. But you can't assume that a middle name that looks like a surname will turn out to be the mother's maiden name. It may come from a generation further back, or from some other branch of the family, or from somewhere else altogether. I found that Russell Scott and Isabella Civil Prestwich, another interesting middle name there, were married at St Mary's Church, Lambeth, in 1832. And I also found Isabella's baptism much earlier in Battersea. And this is where it really helps to know the geography of the place where you're going to research. It so happens that Battersea and Wandsworth are neighbouring parishes. And there can often be several different perfectly correct ways of describing the same place or a general area. People might give the name of a very small place, such as an area within a parish, a village, or even the nearest large town, depending on the context when they are asked the question. And remember that parish boundaries aren't physical boundaries, and baptisms could very easily be in the parish next door to where the parents lived. I can think of at least one place where the parish church is almost on the parish boundary. And a lot of homes in the neighbouring parish are much nearer to that church than they are to their own parish church. So many people there had their children baptised in the other parish. Church of England baptisms at this time give you the date of the baptism, the name of the child and the parents, the father's occupation and their abode. This might be a street address in a city, but more often it'll just be the name of the parish. But this can be a useful way of finding out that a family has a connection with a parish other than the one where they're having a child baptised. And the father's occupation can be useful for sorting out baptisms into families if there are two couples in the same parish with exactly the same names, and this does happen. This format for baptisms was introduced in 1813. And before that, there was no standard format, but in practice, most entries give even fewer details than those from 1813 onwards. Now, these records were fairly easy to find because they've been digitised and indexed online, but it isn't always that simple. Parish records are held in local or county record offices, and online access to them will depend on any arrangements made by the record office itself. Records from some counties may be on one of the main family history sites, and while there is some overlap between them, some will only be found on one of the sites. And as well as records that include images of the original documents, you will often find some that are just indexes or transcripts. And while these are very useful, you should always try to see a copy of the image itself. This is because the original records may contain extra information that isn't in the transcript. And of course, a transcription might not be accurate, especially if the original was hard to read. Remember, a transcription is only what someone else thinks the record says. And when you look at an entry in a parish register, you should look at the other records around it, not just the one with your ancestor in it. That way you will learn something about other families in the parish, and you might spot other names that are familiar to you, perhaps names of people who married into your family. Again, geography is important because if your ancestors lived in a parish close to a county boundary, you may need to look on two or more different sites or in different archives to find them if they moved between parishes. People in the past moved around more often than we sometimes give them credit for. They might not have gone very far, but it was quite common to move between parishes within a small area, and that small area might straddle county boundary. Although most records in this period are held in local record offices, there are some exceptions. If you look for the baptism of Russell Scott in Portsmouth, you wouldn't find it, because, unlike his future wife, he wasn't baptised in the Church of England, because his family belonged to the substantial minority of the population who were nonconformists. These churches kept their own records, and their registers were called in by the Registrar General after the start of civil registration in 1837, and we hold them here at the National Archives. The collection's by no means complete because not all of the records were handed in, and they do vary a lot in the amount of detail they hold, but they're very well indexed online and the images are available on several different sites. And as well as the registers kept by local congregations, they include the records of 2 nonconformist birth registries, and their records can be very detailed. This page shows the birth of Russell Scott in 1801 and his sister Sophia in 1804, and these entries tell you quite a lot about the family. You'll also find some of Russell and Isabella's children in nonconformist registers, even though the couple married in the Church of England, and there's a very good reason for this. Between 1754 and 1837, only Church of England marriages were legally valid, so everyone had to marry there regardless of their beliefs. So that's where you need to look for marriages for Baptists, Catholics, Methodists, Unitarians, or anyone else in England and Wales. Only Quakers and Jews were exempt, and they could legally marry in their own places of worship. So you can get information on births or baptisms, marriages and burials from church records of one kind or another before 1837, but it may take a little more effort than using civil registration records. Burial registers unfortunately give even less detail than death certificates, just name, age and abode. So as I mentioned earlier, it is much harder to know if you've found the right entry, but you can use a variety of other sources to help, and wills are among the most useful for this. Before 1858, there's no central registry, and wills could have been proved in a variety of different church courts held in different archives. We have a very large collection here, and many local collections are indexed online, so they are fairly easy to find. And at the National Archives, we also have the Inland Revenue's death duty registers from 1796 to 1904, which contain some details on how an estate was distributed. The indexes are online, and they constitute probably the nearest thing we have to a national probate index before 1858. So an index entry can lead you to find the place where the actual will itself is kept. And wills can contain lots of information on family members, and relationships might be described in very great detail because it was so important that the right person should receive each bequest. And there could be more than one person in the family with the same name. And even if your ancestor didn't leave a will, they can still help you establish that someone of the same name as your ancestor was not your ancestor. Members of families like the Scots were very likely to leave wills as they were fairly prosperous. People who owned property or businesses or were members of the professions or officers in the armed forces will have left much more of a paper trail than most, which makes them much easier to find. But most of us have ancestors from lower down the scale, and we'll need to look for our corroborating evidence elsewhere, even if we can get a little help from the wills. A really helpful place to look in local records is the enormous amount of paperwork created by the Poor Law. Every parish was responsible for looking after its own poor, its disabled, and those who were too old to work. And they raised money for this by collecting poor rates. Everyone paid in except the very poorest, and parishes kept lists of the payments and of the sums paid out. So every family will be recorded in one way or another, although the records don't always survive. The most informative records relate to the very poorest in society. Parishes were always very careful with the money they'd collected from their ratepayers, so when someone applied to the parish for poor relief, as it was called, they wanted to make sure that that person or family was their responsibility and not that of some other parish. everyone belonged to a parish. This was called their parish of settlement. And this wasn't necessarily the parish where they were born, because you could do a number of things throughout your life to gain a settlement somewhere else, such as working in another parish for long enough, or holding public office there, or by marriage if you were a woman, because you would take your husband's place of settlement. Any records that do survive will be held in local archives, usually with the parish registers. And some of them are online, but the great majority are not. There isn't time to describe all the different kinds of records created by the Poor Law, but it is always well worth finding out what the local archive holds for the area that you're researching in. And they may also have research guides on the subject too. The very best of these records are called settlement examinations, where an applicant would be asked in detail about their lives, their work, and their families. Anything, in fact, that they might have done that will have affected their place of settlement. And where there was any kind of dispute between parishes about who was responsible for a particular case, and there often was, it would be resolved in a local court known as the quarter sessions. These courts also dealt with lots of other matters like disputes between neighbours and minor criminal offences. So these records are a very rich source of information on individuals and families. You won't find them online, but some archives have quite detailed catalogue information. So if an ancestor was involved in any kind of dispute, you might find out about it there. Court records in general can be very useful for criminal as well as civil cases, and there are lots of them about. They can be tricky to use because of the way that the records were kept by the courts in the first place, but it is worth getting to know how the system worked. And more records are being indexed and digitised all the time. And the National Archives has a number of guides on civil and criminal courts, whether the records are held here or elsewhere. And your ancestor didn't have to be litigious or be a criminal to appear in these records. They might have been a victim or a witness or a juror. Poor law records and wills and probate and the various court records are very helpful and can tell you a lot about some individuals, but there are still other records to explore. Although there's no real equivalent of the census records before 1841, there are lots of records that might be described as census substitutes or listings. These are often just lists of names that don't appear to tell you very much, but a series of them can establish an ancestor's residence in a particular place over a period of years. They will often be rate or tax lists, or possibly even voters lists. For example, a series of annual tax lists will usually have names in the same order. So when a man's name appears in several in succession, and then is replaced by another name, that could be an indication that he died or has left the parish. If his name is replaced by the widow with his surname, that's a very good indication that he's probably died. And this can be very helpful when the burial registers don't include ages, which is quite common before 1813. These are just some of the records that might contain family information for you, but you will find others once you start looking. You might find records on people's occupations. And in this period, before large-scale industrialisation, many more trades required an apprenticeship than you will find in the later 19th century. The National Archives holds records of the tax on apprenticeships, and although they only record that the tax was paid, this information can help point you to the local archives where the apprenticeship records might still be held. Again, not all of the records survive. Local archives might also have records of guilds and livery companies that governed many trades in this period. And when you know where your ancestors came from, you really need to look at what records are going to be available for that area. And it will vary. Some archives will have good collections of records of a type that doesn't exist elsewhere or that doesn't survive in any quantity. These might be records of local charities, they might be property records, or one-off local census-like surveys. So although you might be discouraged at first when you find yourself without the familiar civil registration and census records, there is still plenty you can do. If you manage to research back nearly 2 centuries, you've already developed some research skills. Once you have those, you can apply them to any set of records. The important thing is to make sure you've found the right person and not just someone with the right name in roughly the right place. And by using some of the sources I've suggested, you should be able to do that. More and more records are being digitised and indexed all the time, which will help you. And the more you research, the better a researcher you'll become.